Imagine bargaining for a pair of leather sandals in a local Middle Eastern flea market. And after successfully striking a deal for the lowest possible price, you suddenly notice that they have ancient Hebrew script written all over them. This could have been the fate of the Dead Sea Scrolls library if it weren't for the keen eye of one scholar who identified the scrolls for what they really were, the find of the century. What are the Dead Sea Scrolls and how were they discovered? Who were the first scholars to recognize the significance of the Qumran discovery? We will discuss these questions and many more in our first lesson in this course. Thank you, Dr. Evans, very much for joining us. We appreciate you coming and visiting us. Could you please tell a little bit of the story around the modern discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Well, the modern discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, I suppose, could be traced back to the 1890s when, of course, no one knew it was a Dead Sea Scroll. But the first copy of the Damascus document came to light. And Solomon Schechter published it in 1910. It was found amongst the Geniza fragments, over 100,000 of them, in the Ben Ezra synagogue in Cairo. And so this was quite a treasure trove, and it's a story all on its own. But he published it in 1910 under the title of a fragment of a Zadokite work. And actually, he was right on the money, and because that's what that text was all about. Now, what he didn't know was that it was part of an Essene library. And some scholars did speculate that this might have been something produced by the Essenes. That was amazing, prophetic, actually. But the big discovery came in 1947, spring, early summer, we estimate, sometime in then. There, and of course with a well-known story, which maybe it's partly true, maybe it's a little bit of an embellishment, I don't know. But the Bedouin lad who throws the stone into a hole, supposedly trying to scare goats out of the ravine, trying to find them. Maybe he's bored, I don't know. But he throws the stone in, and it hits something. It hits a ceramic jar, a clay jar, and it breaks. And he's curious. Oh, wait a minute. This is not the sound of a stone bouncing around in a cave. And so he hoists himself up. Scholars later made a hole a little lower so it's easier to get in the cave. But he hoists himself up, finds jars, and finds scrolls. He's disappointed. He was hoping to find gold and valuables. Well, he really did find valuables. He just didn't know it. So he gathered a few of them up and he took them back, and he knew of this Kando fellow who was on good terms with the Bedouin and Palestinians. And so Kando examined it and at first thought about it as just shoe leather. Can you imagine you'd buy a pair of sandals and on the bottom of the sole is Isaiah 53. Fortunately, Kando had enough sense to get a second opinion, and his priest was the Mar Samuel. He's a Kando, Palestinian Christian. Mar Samuel had enough knowledge and education to realize this is important. This could actually be very old. And so he showed it to a number of people, including a couple of scholars. To their embarrassment, they said, oh, these are not ancient, they're medieval. But eventually, Eleazar Sukenik saw the scroll and he wanted to buy them. And so he was the first scholar, and this would be in November of 1947. He was the first scholar to recognize that these scrolls are ancient and they're valuable, and it's Israel's heritage, and so Israel needs to own these. And so even though these caves were at that time in Jordan, he wanted to acquire them, and the Bedouin and Kando and others were more than willing to sell them, and so he acquired some of them, and years later his son Yigal Yadin acquired several more, 4 more, and this led to the building of the Shrine of the Book, which is part of the Israel Museum, which you can all see now in Jerusalem. And so that's a short form of the story, how it unfolded.
How could something as valuable as the Dead Sea Scrolls have been lost in the first place?
Well, yeah, those are the vicissitudes of history. These things happen. When the men of Qumran hid these scrolls in various caves for their safeguarding because of the war, they knew that the Romans were approaching. Now that could be in the year 68, when General Vespasian, who was prosecuting the war against the Jewish rebels, the rebellion began in 66. Nero appointed Vespasian in charge of the Roman army. He has captured Galilee. He has captured Josephus, who later would tell us the story. He is now encamped at Jericho awaiting developments in Rome because Nero was out of control and condemned by the Senate and in fact committed suicide. So Vespasian just waited. Now, it was during that time, perhaps, that he captured Qumran and destroyed the compound there. Or it was 5 years later when General Silva marched along the western shore of the Dead Sea to capture Masada, and that's a famous story in its own. So it's either 68 or it's 73. Qumran is destroyed. Now the point is, the men of Qumran had hid these scrolls, I'm sure intending to collect them again and continue their work. The community was wiped out, survivors were probably taken captive, and no one ever went back again. And so those scrolls lay in those caves for 19 centuries, and then they were discovered.
What are the chances that these scrolls actually were previously discovered in antiquity? Aren't there references to these scrolls in antiquity by other writers?
Actually, yes. We have a couple of cases where there's reference to some old scripture scrolls written in Hebrew characters. And one of them actually says found in a jar near Jericho. So, you know, I think that must have been, somebody must have found a cave. I don't know if it's one of the 11 caves that eventually were discovered in the 20th century. Was it an unknown 12th cave? I mean, I don't know. But I think what's being talked about in the Middle Ages is an actual scroll or two recovered from one of the caves. And that caused a lot of interest, but it didn't lead to a search party examining all of the caves. That happened in the 20th century.
Are all of these scrolls and documents accounted for? Where are these scrolls now?
Well, most of the scrolls are in Jerusalem. For years and years, many of them were housed at the Rockefeller Museum. Most of them now are either at the Shrine of the Book or in facilities in Jerusalem, not necessarily disclosed. A few of them, like the Copper Scroll, are in Amman, Jordan. A few others are here and there among universities and so on. A few remain actually in Kando's family in a safe deposit vault or something like that in Switzerland. That's an interesting story. Some small fragments may yet still be in the hands of some Bedouin. From time to time, somebody contacts somebody and there's an offer for sale, and for a few $1,000s, a scroll fragment is surrendered. The late Hanan Eshel, a few years back, collected a few fragments that way. And so it's an interesting story. We all think of those 11 caves from 1947 to 1956, 900 documents recovered, and yet, you know, we keep picking up one or two here and there as the years have gone by. Nehemiah was found just 5 or 6 years ago. We did not have a fragment of the book of Nehemiah. Now we have a fragment of chapter 3, verses 14 and 15. So, you know, those things happen, and I suspect in the next several years we'll hear about a few more fragments that come to light. What I'd really like is for somebody using ground-penetrating radar to discover a cave that the mouth of which has been covered. They open it up, and inside are another 100 scrolls. That would be exciting.
We all wish for that. That would be good.
That might
really
be wishful
exciting.
thinking, but that would really be neat.
Could you please define what's referred to as the Judean Desert Corpus and how the Qumran documents relate to that?
Yeah. When you speak of the Judean, the writings from the Judean desert or the Dead Sea region, you'll hear that language sometimes used. That means everything, and it's not just Qumran and the 11 caves that give us the 900 documents, Qumran or Dead Sea Scrolls. There's Nahal Hever, which is further south and has given us several important writings, including Bar Kokhba letters to Bar Kokhba and letters from. Remember, Bar Kokhba, son of the star, that's Simon ben Kosoba. He's the leader of the third great revolt, 132 to 135, that the Roman Emperor Hadrian had to put down. We have the Babatha archive, 30-some letters, mostly legal matters. We have some other scriptures from a later time. We actually have some Christian writings from a much later time. Actually, some scroll-related materials were found at Masada. And so the Dead Sea region has been very kind to us in the last 100 years in producing lots of materials for study that help us understand Christian origins and the change in Judaism much better.
So what exactly is referred to by the term Dead Sea Scrolls?
Well, most people think of Qumran. When you say the Dead Sea Scrolls, they think of the 11 caves at Qumran. But you can say, well, actually, you mean all of the writings recovered from the Dead Sea area, and that would include the Bar Kokhba letters, the Nachal Hever materials, Babatha Archive, and Mutaba'at, and Wadi Murd, and a few other places. So, you know, I think it's wise to be very clear what's being referred to.
So when someone mentions the Dead Sea Scrolls, generally what one is talking about are the documents that were found in the 11 caves by Qumran.
Yes, that's a discrete library. We have sectarian writings, you know, that are unique to them, that reflect their perspective, found in almost all of the caves. And Cave 7 would be an exception. And so these are writings that reflect that community, and I guess we could call it their headquarters, the actual ruins at the mouth. It's a plateau right at the mouth of the Wadi Qumran, that then whenever it occasionally rains and the water rushes down, it would then go into the Dead Sea. And so the men of Qumran set up an aqueduct and several cisterns and mikvaot that would then be filled with water whenever it did rush through, and they were very good at water conservation. So when we speak of the Dead Sea Scrolls, that's what we usually mean. Sometimes people will use as shorthand, they'll just simply say Qumran, and what they mean are the writings found at or near Qumran.
Could you talk about the naming of the scrolls? What does the Q stand for, and why do these scrolls have so many different names?
Yeah, and of course when the first cave was found, nobody used the word Q, but when caves 2, 3, and 4 in rapid succession were discovered, they realized, oops, we have to change it. Can't just say DS, you know, as they used to. And so they came up with the 1Q, 2Q, 3Q, 4Q, etc., all the way up to 11Q. And what the Q means there is Qumran. And then the number that precedes it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 11, whatever, means the cave number. So whenever you see somebody refer to something like, you know, 4Q 521, then that means Qumran Cave 4 document number 521. Now, with a few exceptions, the scrolls have all been numbered. And some of these scrolls, many of them in fact, have received names. And so I mentioned 4Q 521. It's also called the Messianic Apocalypse, which I'm sure eventually we will talk about. 4Q 246, the Son of God text. But some texts are so fragmentary, we're not real sure what exactly they are. We have a vague idea of their theme or contents, and they just have a number. Sometimes this is a complexity. My students are puzzled because they'll look and they'll say, well, wait a minute, I don't understand it. This is 4Q something or other, A, and 4Q something or other, B, C, D, E, and it just keeps on going through the alphabet. And often that happened because there was a large collection, 200-300 fragments, which were thought to be part of the same scroll. So it gets a number, and then they move on and start numbering other scrolls. Then, after carefully analyzing the heap of fragments, they realized, wait a minute, these fragments belong to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or more different scrolls that happen to be similar, with similar vocabulary. So they have to start making distinctions, and you end up with the A, B, C, D, and you know. So it's rather convoluted sometimes. They didn't mean it to be that way, but that's just how it goes. As you know, the work isn't finished, still sifting through these fragments. That's why the number keeps getting bigger. You know, when I first heard about the scrolls, the number was over 300. And then as the years went by, well, it's more like 500. And by the time I was a PhD student, they were confidently talking about at least 800. And now it's 900. And so I wouldn't be surprised as they sift these fragments and try to identify discrete individual documents. That number could reach 1,000.